Well, hello there! Welcome! Please come in. I know this might not be what you were expecting, but you and I, we're going to go on so many adventures! We're going to have so much fun. Forever and ever and ever and ever and ever.
Hello, Internet! Welcome to Film Theory, the show that's here to show you the most jaw-dropping, heart-stopping, mind-bending theories you can imagine. In case you missed our last theory on the amazing digital circus, the long and short of it is that we believe that the circus here isn't exactly what it appears to be. Instead of some futuristic, fully immersive experience, we believe that it's actually a VR video game from the 1990s, one that copies the brains of anyone who puts on the headset. It then turns that copy into a digital character to go on adventures throughout the circus. So the people trapped in this world looking for an exit, they're not actually people, just digital copies of their consciousnesses, their personalities. That's why we repeatedly see workstations of VR headsets in the first episode, but with no one actually wearing the headsets. And our theories didn't stop there. We continued by saying that Pomni is either the creator of the game or an employee at the development studio making the game, as evidenced by our mental breakdown when seeing those work desks. And while this is the direction that I still believe the series is headed for,
how about we talk about something else?
You see, there's still a ton to dig into here with the digital circus. Well, sure, those initial theories are the ones that I think are the most likely and the most intentional. It's once to stretch a bit further out that some of the truly fun, wacky ideas really start to develop. Are they right? Yeah, probably not. Are they interesting and fun? Absolutely. And therein lies the beauty of theory crafting. For example, last time I briefly tossed out a bit of wild speculation that the digital circus may have itself some biblical connections. In this brief scene exploring the backrooms of the company who seemingly created the circus, we see the initials C and A painted onto the wall. C made me immediately connect things back to our lovable AI ringleader Cain, a guy who's probably the most in control of this entire situation. And if you tend to see the name Cain partnered with the initial A in any sort of pop cultural reference, the first immediate jump is going to be to the biblical story of Cain and Abel. See, Cain and Abel were the children of Adam and Eve, the first humans to ever exist in the Abrahamic religions. At the time, I wasn't really sure if this was meant to be anything or if it was going to lead anywhere, but the more I sat and thought about it, the more connections that I started to make. Some of those connections were admittedly very dumb. For example, in biblical canon, Cain kills Abel and becomes the first murderer. And what does Cain do multiple times throughout the pilot? He pops bubble for comedic effect. Ow! You parasite! Cain kills a bubble, a bull. Coincidence? Absolutely yes. It is single-handedly one of the dumbest things I've ever said in a theory, and I have said a lot of dumb things in theories. But other parallels that I found as I was doing this little brain search through the episode again were a lot more compelling. In fact, some connections were so large that I believe I may have just cracked the question of what the digital circus is wide open. You see, loyal theorists, the amazing digital circus isn't just some mere video game that's trapped these consciousnesses. No. It's something much darker. It's an eternity of torment and torture. The amazing digital circus is, quite literally, hell. Put on your headsets and get your randomly generated names, my friends. We're going in. So the claim that the digital circus is literally hell is a pretty bold one, so why would I possibly make it? Well, look at this. At the very end of the pilot, here we're shown all the human characters sitting at a table while eating food. But you notice anything weird about their dining arrangement? Of all the ways they could have set up this table, they decided to have every character on just one side, all of them facing the same direction, out at us, the audience. When this is done in fiction, it's rarely by mistake, because this right here, this is a very iconic framing device from one of the most famous paintings ever made, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. This depicts the final meal of Jesus and his followers shared before his crucifixion. It's been the backbone of conspiracy theories and Dan Brown novels for centuries. Gooseworks, creator of the series, and all the other creatives over at Glitch, they're smart people. They wouldn't be using this imagery without understanding the historical baggage that comes along with it. And it's not just the table layout that's worth calling out here. Look at Pomni in the center, the exact position that Jesus is in for the painting. And notice the colors of Pomni, red and blue. Wouldn't it be weird if, oh wait, never mind, Jesus is also dressed in red and blue. The interpretation of his colors is that the blue represents the divine half of God, heaven, and his red represents the blood, mankind. So in Jesus, you have the mixing of these two elements, a God born amongst men and set to live as a human, red plus blue. And in Pomni, we actually have something similar, at least if our earlier theories were correct. A creator of this game, a god of this world, if you will, now set to live as a part of their own creation. And it's not like religion is completely absent from this world either. Quite the contrary. We know for a fact that God exists in the circus in some form or another. During the first adventure that Cain sets up for Pomni, the Gloink Queen says this:
I am Gloinks. You will be Gloinks. God will be Gloinks.
What an oddly specific thing to say. Speaking of making oddly specific references that we can build off of, let's talk about abstraction. According to the show, when you obsess over being trapped in the circus and drive yourself crazy looking for a way out,
eventually you get to asking what the point of anything is, and you completely lose sight of who you are and why you're even alive, and when you reach your breaking point, something really terrible can happen.
this is known as abstraction, and we see the results of it when we meet Kaufmo the Clown, or at least what's left of him.
Oh, Kaufmo's been obstructed.
Last time, I wasn't really sure if we had enough to really make a judgment over what was happening here, but I did find some more information when digging through the creator Gooseworks' Tumblr. According to her, abstracting isn't just going crazy and becoming a big scary monster. It's definitely part of it for sure, but there is a deeper meaning. According to Gooseworks, when you abstract, you lose everything about yourself. You're stripped of every single scrap of individuality that you become something unrecognizable. All abstracted people look the same, this glitchy four-legged monster covered in eyeballs. And perhaps most importantly, abstraction cannot be undone. Now, looking back over the series with this new lens of religious imagery, the abstracted start resembling something else, something beyond just monsters. They almost look like angels. Well, not really angels, more biblically accurate angels, which, ironically enough, doesn't really come from the Bible. Let me explain, it's kind of confusing. 3 years ago, a meme started spreading across the internet featuring these monstrous multi-eyed creations. They were called biblically accurate angels. Now, you might look at these things and go, really? They don't exactly look like the traditional image of an angel with robes and wings and halos and all that. But what they're riffing on here is a very specific part of the Bible. A few chapters in the book of Ezekiel where he describes having visions of winged creatures with 4 faces, some human, some animal, and these creatures were joined by wheels within wheels with eyes. Here's a version of the quote. I looked, and I saw beside the cherubim 4 wheels, one beside each of the cherubim. Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands, and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were their 4 wheels. Now, for the sake of clarity, the wheels with eyes, or ophonym, both are and aren't considered angels depending on what documents you're using and how you're classifying things. And again, all of this is based on a few very short lines in a very long, very ancient religious tradition, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that these religious entities are always described as having an abnormal number of eyes all over their bodies, just like the abstracted that we're seeing in Digital Circus. The weird descriptions even fit with the name abstraction. These so-called biblically accurate angels are weird, almost completely unrecognizable to humans because we can't comprehend what we're witnessing. They're unknowable. In other words, they're abstract. Now, while it's never made clear why these biblical creatures would have so many eyes, one persistent idea is that the design represents God's watchful eye over us. They're always watching us because God knows all. He sees all. Look again at the Digital Circus. There's a ton of eyeball imagery here, all throughout this first episode. Eyes are hidden in the intro, they're hidden in paintings, they're hidden in the background. Cain even admits that he wants all the cast to stay in the circus,
Where I can keep my hundreds of all-seeing eyes on you.
Cain, an omniscient character who knows everything, a god of sorts. And what's he made of? Basically a mouth and 2 big ol' eyes. Oh, and looking at Cain's dialogue through this more religious lens makes this line hit a whole lot different.
Do you like adventure, activity, wonder, danger, horror, pain, suffering, agony, death, disease, death, angel food cake?
Ow! Not only does suffering, agony, and death all sound very hellish, but why angel food cake? Like, why call out that specific type of cake here? Again, we have ourselves a weird connection to angels and religion that comes seemingly out of nowhere. But the most compelling reason for why we can draw parallels between this series and all these religious ideas has to be the way that the creator Gooseworks talks about the Digital Circus. When asked if anyone in the series would be killed, Gooseworks answered that it depends on your definition of kill, which is likely pointing to the idea of abstraction. But it's interesting that she makes this distinction. It means that none of these characters can die, so to speak. They're trapped in here forever in eternal torment, just like hell. Gooseworks also talks about how characters deserve to be there, specifically calling out Jax as the one who deserves to be there the most. Using the phrase deserves to be there, it shows that the circus is some place of judgment. It's either a reward for those who are good or a punishment for those who are evil. And considering Gooseworks has a lot of negative things to say about Jax, this ain't your reward day at the spa. Time Time and time again, Gooseworks has gone on the record to say how awful Jax is. According to Gooseworks, Jax is morally the worst character in the show, so much so that when asked if he was more of a jerk or an anti-hero, she explained that, quote, "There's absolutely nothing heroic about Jax." Those are some pretty strong words for a character that you yourself created. When another fan commented that they hoped Jax was gonna get worse, Gooseworks said, "You're probably gonna enjoy some of the things we have planned." And already the behavior that we've seen from him throughout the series is pretty awful. He's mean, he trips people, he knocks them over, he steps on one of Gangle's masks without caring. He knows that Ragatha's deepest fear is centipedes, and he uses that information to torture her.
By the way, I may have left something in your room today, so let me know if you find it. You're not afraid of centipedes, are you?
Jax! That's literally my only fear. Why would you do this?
Jax is clearly not a good person. So if Gooseworks is saying that he deserves to be in the circus more than most, then it clearly implies that we're trapped in hell. But just because they're in hell doesn't necessarily mean it has to be your typical fire and brimstone hell. Case in point, one of the most influential depictions of hell comes from a play by French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, known as Huis Clos, or translated into English, No Exit. In it, 3 people condemned to hell are brought into the same room and locked inside, but instead of a torture chamber, they just find a comfortably furnished room. Not exactly what you'd expect, right? But as these 3 start talking and getting to know each other, they realize they don't click. They annoy each other, they push each other's buttons, and they twist the knife until one of them realizes this is the torture. A famous line from the play reads, "Hell is other people." That sounds exactly like what we see here in the digital circus. It's 6 people who don't necessarily click with one another, and no matter how polite they are, they all still push each other's buttons. They exploit each other's fears and fake laugh at each other's jokes. But the worst part of all, there's no exit. Trapped in a digital room with no escape. But now to the big question. What's the point? It's all interesting for sure, but why bring up all these parallels? Well, if we can point to all these religious ideas to show what the digital circus is and how they're going to be using it in the story, we can also use them to point to where the story is headed. Specifically, I believe that we can use the religious imagery to get a pretty good idea of what Pomni's story arc is going to be. You see, Pomni is digital circus's parallel to Jesus Christ. I know that sounds insane. Sounds crazy enough for one of those MatPat out of context compilations that I see floating around. But the connections are there when you actually stop and look at them. I mean, think back to what I pointed out earlier about the Last Supper scene. Pomni is framed as the one in the center, exactly where Jesus is sitting in the painting. Her color scheme matches Jesus's. His robes are split between 2 colors, red and blue, just like Pomni's jester outfit. Additionally, we have to consider Pomni's hand. About halfway through the episode, when the abstracted Kaufmo attacks Ragatha and makes her glitch, Pomni tries to help her and gets her hand glitched in the process. This plotline is actually left unresolved at the end of the episode, with Cain fixing Ragatha, but not Pomni, who keeps the glitching hand a secret. In Christianity, wounds or scars on your hand like this usually reference a very specific thing, stigmata. These are representative of the wounds that Jesus got when he was being hammered onto the cross, usually depicted as scars on your hands. Another connection to Pomni. And if our previous theory is correct and Pomni's human persona is an employee of the company behind the digital circus, well, she's the developer of this game. That would make her the creator. And just like Jesus is an aspect of God in many sects of Christianity, that would make Pomni an aspect of a god or creator of this world. Heck, her arc in the very first episode, forgetting who she is so that the information can be dramatically revealed to her later on, it even follows what Jesus went through in biblical texts, beginning life as a human before having to discover for himself that he is in fact the Son of God, discovering his purpose to save humanity from themselves. And this is why I think we have to care about all this. Why we started looking at all these religious parallels in the first place. If the digital circus is indeed designed to be hell, and everyone here is condemned to be there in some way, and Pomni suddenly comes in as a representative of Jesus, well, she's there to save them, to help the other cast members escape from this torment that they found themselves in Pomni's creation. But in the cruelest twist of fate, saving them is gonna doom Pomni. If I was a betting man, I'd say that Pomni will be the only one left in the digital circus after she's helped all the others to escape. Just like Jesus sacrificed himself for humanity, Pomni is gonna do the same thing here. She's gonna get left behind, forever tortured by this wacky AI going on his silly adventures. But it'll have been worth it because she'll manage to save everyone else. But hey, though the cast of the amazing digital circus might be being burned by their experience on the computer, you don't have to be, thanks to our sponsor for today's video, Opera. Ever since Opera first approached us, I've been really impressed with how much they've packed into their browsers, including their latest. One of the big feature upgrades though in this new Opera browser is Lucid Mode, which instantly instantly sharpens any online video with just the click of a button. Listen friends, not all of the YouTube series out there are as crisp as the 1440p goodness of the amazing Digital Circus. Sometimes you're dealing with blurry footage shot in a potato cam from 1976. But with Opera, you can actually turn on lucid mode, which will help you increase the sharpness of the video in real time. No joke, this is an actual feature in this thing. There are even different levels of enhancements that you can select. You can check what the video looks like beforehand and after right there on the screen. So if something just needs a little tweak to look perfect, lucid mode can do that. But if it needs some heavy lifting, well, lucid mode can do that too. Also, you don't miss a single detail hidden in the background of these videos. You know me, I'm all about efficiency, and that is the name of the game when you're talking about the Opera browser. They have a free VPN and an ad blocker integrated right into this thing, so you can protect your privacy and security while venturing out into the void without needing to download any extra extensions. Plus, the Opera sidebar has buttons for everything, from Facebook Messenger to Spotify to WhatsApp and beyond, and it's all built right in. That way you don't need to switch windows to change what you're listening to or to message your friends. The real game changer for me though, and I've mentioned this one before, has got to be tab islands. As someone who just does a lot of research for their job, I can often have hundreds of tabs open across everything. It used to be a nightmare having to navigate across all those tabs, but the Opera browser makes it so much easier thanks to the tab islands. Basically, you can assign tabs into different groups in the same window and drag and drop tabs between them. Each group also has itself a unique color, that way you know exactly what you're looking at. Here are the dozens of Tumblr asks that I have open in blue, all the references to the Bible in red, 90s game factoids in yellow. You can even collapse the island so you don't have a billion little website icons all littering up the top of your browser. Real talk, this might be the single best internet feature to ever come about since bookmarking. So if you want to upgrade the way that you browse the web, check out Opera by using my link below and downloading the Opera browser today. Thanks again to Opera for sponsoring today's video, and as always, my friends, remember, it's all just a theory. A film theory. And cut.
News this week includes Intel wanting to make AMD's CPUs.
No!
Also, we'll be covering PSP mods for the PlayStation Portal. Additionally, there's this weird peripheral. And Thermalright has a baby version of the Peerless Assassin. Before that, this video is brought to you by Lian Li and the O11D Evo XL. The O11D Evo XL builds upon the long-standing strengths of the O11D series by adding new features, like a rotated GPU layout to showcase the most important part of a build. The Evo XL also uses a removable motherboard tray that can adjust for different heights, making it tunable for every style. Additionally, these cases use Lian Li's compartmentalized approach to design to keep cables cleanly hidden behind the back of the case. Learn more at the link in the description below. So up first, Intel is currently pushing its Foundry Services, or IFS, so hard that it is willing to make products for its competition. We've actually talked about this for a little bit. There's been discussion of Intel potentially making some NVIDIA products in the future, but this is part of Intel's decoupling of its fab plants, its Foundry Services, from its product teams, and it's continuing. So Intel recently started talking more about its 18 angstrom process node, and there was a Q&A session during Intel's IFS Direct Connect. Tom's Hardware, among other outlets, attended it, and Tom's posed this question to Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger. They asked, Intel will now offer its process nodes to some of its competitors, and there may be situations wherein your product teams are competing directly directly with competitors that are enabled by your crown jewels. How do you plan to navigate those types of situations and maybe soothe ruffled feathers on your product teams? Gelsinger replied and said this: there are Intel products and Intel Foundry. There's a clean line between those. And as I said on the last earnings call, we'll have a set up separate legal entity for Intel Foundry this year. We'll start posting separate financials associated with that going forward. The Foundry team's objective is simple: fill the fabs, deliver to the broadest set of customers on the planet. After this statement, Intel shares plummeted in price. Only one planet? Going further, Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger outlined some of the potentially competing customers that he'd like to serve with IFS, despite helping the enemy along the way in their attempt to overthrow TSMC and Samsung and make sure that Intel stays #1 as a foundry. So he said, quote, "We hope that includes Jensen or NVIDIA, Cristiano from Qualcomm, Sundar from Google, and you heard today it includes Satya from Microsoft. And I even hope that includes Lisa going forward. I mean, we want to be the foundry for the world." There it is again, just that narrow mindset of only one world. And if we're going to be the Western foundry at scale, we can't be discriminating about who's participating in that. Again, apparently, unless they're from a different planet, then it's okay. Intel continued and said, so unequivocally, it is to be the foundry for the world. Commit supply chains, leadership technology, the doors to the a la carte menu are wide open for the industry. Strategically, this has been a bold and actually consistent strategy for Intel for a while now. So IFS has been one of the honestly most interesting aspects of what Intel's doing, maybe alongside ARC, at least for our part of the market. And that's because IFS stands to potentially shore up Intel against setbacks that its product team might face. This probably was at least partially inspired by their extremely long delays in getting new architecture to market. On the CPU side, where AMD really gave Intel some trouble for a couple of years there, and still is, but it was a little more serious a few generations back. And so probably at some point in that window, they were looking at it going, how do we make sure we have money coming in, even if the product team is lagging behind on getting stuff out the door? So IFS being separate is probably a good thing. Either way, the rest of the Tom's Hardware article has some more interesting insights and quotes regarding Intel's willingness to be flexible with unique mixed chiplet packages. So you can read that if that piques your interest. But there's more to this story, and moving on from that, Intel also leaned heavily into the AI marketing in this discussion and talking with Microsoft about the roadmap for that. Capitalizing on the buzz that is AI, Intel has launched Intel Foundry, which the company is billing as, quote, the world's first systems foundry for the AI era. The announcement was made at the same event in Santa Clara, California, in which Intel added its 14-angstrom process to its technology roadmap. Intel revealed a new roadmap that includes updates to its Intel 3, 18-angstrom, and 14-angstrom processes. In a press release, Intel stated that it is planning a new node every 2 years, not counting refreshes in between. The company also claimed it expects to regain process leadership in 2025 with its 18-angstrom process. At the event, Microsoft announced that it would be using an 18A chip with company CEO Satya Nadella, stating this, quote, we're in the midst of a very exciting platform shift that'll fundamentally transform productivity for every individual organization and the entire industry. To achieve this vision, we need a reliable supply of the most advanced, high-performance, and high-quality semiconductors. That's why we're so excited to work with Intel Foundry, and why we've chosen a chip design we plan to produce on Intel 18A. Up next, more lawsuits. Losing a bit of its cool, CoolerMaster has filed legal complaints against AppleTech, which is a large, actually, supplier for liquid coolers, alongside Enermax and Silverstone, who use AppleTech supply for some of their products. CoolerMaster alleges patent infringement here. That sounds familiar. And the liquid cooler market has long been consolidated. It's really just a few key suppliers where the manufacturers that we cover and you all know, they provide things like new feature sets, some of the engineering, so choosing how thick to make the radiator, maybe changing the specific supply of the impeller that's used, the cold plate, microfin density or height, things like that. But if they're using a supplier, it's companies like the radiator factories or like AppleTech or Asatek, to the extent that they kind of do it, Deep Cool and CoolerMaster, to make the actual moving parts, basically, or assemble them anyway, and source them for the pump and the liquid cooling components, and do some of the engineering on that front. So it's been consolidated for a long time now. Asetek historically was one of the most lawsuit-happy suppliers in the liquid cooling industry, to the extent that in some ways it may have stifled some of the options on the market, but it also encouraged some innovation, and that's why we get such good coolers that we have today in cases of, say, like EK's lineup, where we saw the massive impeller and cooling block when we reviewed their Elite series several years ago. Anyway, Asetek has mostly stopped its lawsuits after investors found out that it's not fun to lose those, and that was after winning several of them. But CodeMaster now is back to try on its own, and interestingly, it has not named Lian Li or MSI that we're aware of as party to any of these lawsuits, despite both of those companies also using Apple tech for its liquid coolers. CodeMaster claims ownership of 3 patents that are relevant here. There's the patent ending in 509446, 061450, and D856941. And CodeMaster alleges that there were a number of product infringements that involve Silverstone's Ice Mist 240, PF240, PF240W, Ice Gem, Vita 240 Slim, and RGB controller, and Enermax's Aqua Fusion ADV, LickMax 3A RGB, LickTech 360 TR42 Slim, and RGB controller. While AppleTech doesn't sell retail CLCs itself, it was included in the lawsuit because it manufactured components for both Enermax and Silverstone here. CodeMaster's filed complaint asserts that there were infringements surrounding the pump inside radiator design, as well as the ARGB mini controller. The company's asking for awards and damages and attorney's fees. As a reminder, CodeMaster itself was sued by Asetek many years ago for AIO liquid cooler patent infringements in 2014, and it was forced to pay the company at least $600,000. It appears now that the hunted has become the hunter. There's an ancient philosopher we'd like to quote here.
There's always a bigger fish.
Some more history for this one. We cut that clip before Jar Jar started talking, so you're welcome. I just didn't want everyone to just leave the video. Why did retention go to 0 specifically here? CodeMaster previously has also been involved in lawsuits and legal complaints from Asetek for things like the Fury X design, that AMD liquid-cooled video card, and Asetek also successfully sued Coolit in the past, which at the time was its primary competitor and was making a lot of Corsair liquid coolers, which also was using Asetek. Corsair was using both at that time. The liquid cooler market here appears to remain one of the most litigious aspects of this industry. This might be interesting. Maybe I'll get Vincent Augusta, the attorney we've worked with for some of the videos in the past, like the Lian Li fans lawsuit against Fantex and Thermaltake. So maybe we'll get him on to talk about this one as well if there's interest in it. Okay, up next, Brazilian games journalist Pedro Henrique Lipe initially reported that the successor to the Nintendo Switch will be coming out in Q1 of 2025, and this claim has since been corroborated by numerous outlets. The short version is that Nintendo has been in communication with games publishers and has prepared them for a planned Q1 25 launch, delayed from previous guidance for Q4 of this year. Multiple outlets, including Eurogamer, reported that this was to allow more time to finalize first-party games and software features. For other Switch 2 news, Digital Foundry previously posted a video noting that the Switch 2 is likely using NVIDIA's T239 processor. In September, VGC reported that Epic's Unreal Engine 5 Matrix Awakens demo was running on the Switch successor with DLSS and ray tracing enabled behind closed doors at Gamescom. Of course, nothing's confirmed at the moment, and guesses abound for what a successor to the Nintendo Switch could be called. They could take a huge risk and go sequential. Switch 2, two follows one. The one is implied on the Switch. Also, they could go for the high-end market. The Switch Pro, for example. Maybe they go with the Switch Super or the TI Super Switch. There's a lot of options here. However, Gamers Nexus can report and confirm that it has received an exclusive leak detailing the name of the Nintendo Switch, and actually, it's going to be called the Nintendo Switch Switcheroo 2. AMD has a rumored 7900 GRE launch for the US market and the rest of Europe and the world. The 7900 GRE is not a new video card. It launched last year in China, and it was limited in market availability in a couple of European countries. So as a quick reminder, the GRE part of the naming stands for Golden Rabbit Edition, which AMD has now used for signifying its China-only launches, and this is maybe an analog to the 4090D or Dragon, which was a China launch as well. And the 7900 GRE is now rumored to be coming to the US market later this month. This is in a report from Video Cards, and they directly referenced the Gigabyte Gaming OC version. This came about because a UK retail site, awd-it.co.uk, posted a listing for sale briefly. The rumored $550 price is potentially interesting too, because the 7800 XT would be below it in the lineup. That retails for $500, and it has significantly different specs. And again, the GRE, we know the specs because it is a card that's already out. The 7900 GRE has 20 more CUs than the 7800 XT, but has lower core and memory clocks and lower bandwidth. So we'll just have to benchmark it. Now, fortunately, we picked up a 7900 GRE actually last year, right around the launch of it. We bought it through AliExpress, I think at the time, or Taobao or something. We never got around to fully testing it because we were so slammed at the end of the year with all the roundups. But we'll go ahead and get it on the benches now, especially since it's allegedly going to have wider availability. So if it comes to be true, we'll have some kind of benchmark or review up for you because now that's going to be wide availability. The whole audience could potentially buy it. It's worth running through the tests. And what we are curious about is at what price would you think it's a good value? Because if it's at this $550 price point, that definitely puts it in competition with a lot of cards from both AMD's existing lineup, its last gen, and NVIDIA's current lineup. So, Thermalright has a Peerless Assassin 120 Mini. They just launched this, and the Mini is in all caps for maximum irony. It's a dual tower design with 6 heat pipes and a single 120mm fan in the middle. The cooler is 135mm tall, making it 22mm shorter than the original. It pushes the fan down lower to rest directly on the top side of the cold plate. This means that the Mini gives up some cooling surface area, but having a fan like this actually positively impacts VRM thermals in a big way in our testing. This one's available for $35, so it's about the same price as the original Peerless Assassin. It's just a little shorter. We are getting one into test. We just bought one actually. It's available in black or white, and we'll have a review in the near future. So at this point, we're rolling pretty fast between the ATX and cooler reviews right now, which feels great because we took almost a year off of ATX case reviews to just rebuild and sort of start fresh with new components, new approach. And now coolers, we took something like 6 months off. So fully back at it. All right, the next story goes off the deep end for peripherals, and it is about a weird new gamepad called the MoveMaster RSG-1, and it seeks to push the peripheral inputs beyond the limitations, whether those are perceived or real. This is an extremely angular chunk of plastic with a pseudo joystick grip on the top for movement and 10 cherry silent keyboard switches arranged within reach of the fingers for other inputs. The basic idea is that keyboards were and are built for typing, not gaming, and it's possible to design something more suited to gaming that offers more than the left half of a standard controller. To give the idea some credit, normal WASD movement occupies 3 fingers, leaving the thumb and pinky obviously to do the rest unless you want to move off of WASD, which sets us up for the perfect infomercial with grayscale and sad-looking actor. So MoveMaster has lots of options to film the "have you ever had this problem?" moving the index finger to E to open a chest in a game, and instantly compromising your position where you can no longer strafe to the right without moving it back, introducing no less than milliseconds of latency. The grip-based movement is what differentiates this, though, from more traditional gamepads like the Razer Tartarus V2 or the long-discontinued Logitech G13. Some of those have thumbsticks on the side to integrate analog-style movement and attempt parts of what MoveMaster's talking about here, but as far as we know, the MoveMaster's layout is unique, and let us know if you're aware of another that does it like this. The company claims that reaction time and the potential for technical movement in-game stays high due to the short distance of travel it takes to actuate. This is maybe a stretch for a comparison, but if you're familiar with the Neo Geo's 8-direction click joystick, it's like that, but you move it with your whole hand. The second row of keys is adjustable, so it can be set to a comfortable distance for each finger. The key switches are swappable via crimped terminals instead of being soldered internally for better repairability or easier customization for those who want a specific cherry-style switch. And the closest competition is probably the Azeron Cyborg, which has way more inputs, but is almost entirely 3D printed. The RSG-1 is reportedly in production and available for €160. Let us know what you think of it. If you buy it, we probably won't be testing it. And finally, Google engineers have hacked the PlayStation Portal, the streaming handheld device that Sony released recently to get it running an emulator natively for the PSP. Google information security engineer Andy Wen tweeted, quote, "After more than a month of hard work, PPSSPP is running natively on PlayStation Portal. Yes, we hacked it with help from XYZ and Zeta 2. In conjunction with this tweet, there was an image of Grand Theft Auto Liberty City's stories running on the handheld. Though the device wasn't designed for natively playing games, Wen noted that the Portal has roughly 6 gigabytes of storage, and the included processing capabilities enables it to actually run some stuff locally. Kind of interesting. Google's engineers said that this is an entirely software-based solution. There were no hardware hacks required, and also indicated that they don't intend to release the expanded functionality anytime soon, but maybe it'll end up out there at some point. The good news is that for those of you who like the PlayStation a lot, now you can play your PlayStation while you play your PlayStation while PlayStation in. It's truly revolutionary times we're in. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, if you want to hear more about consoles, watch the previous episode from a couple days ago. We talked about the N64, and yes, it was news. Otherwise, subscribe for more. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.
When you think of a next-generation warplane, you're probably going to picture one of a small subset of aircraft. Perhaps it's an advanced 5th-generation fighter aircraft, or even one of the 6th-generation planes that will soon take to the skies around the world. Perhaps it's a super-sophisticated drone operating with all the competency of a human pilot in places too dangerous for any person to go. Or perhaps it's something like Top Gun's Dark Star, planes that walk the line between aircraft and spaceship, pushing every limit of aviation while hiding under a heavy veil of secrecy. But one plane that you might probably have left out might be the most critical of all. That is the airborne early warning and control aircraft. Big, slow, visually similar to a commercial aircraft, and utterly incapable in a dogfight, these sorts of aircraft are critical for a different reason. They see everything. They know everything. They control the outcomes of not only individual battles, but modern wars. And in this element, there's one new plane that rules them all. The Boeing 737 AW&C, better known as the Wedgetail. Look, we said it before, we'll say it again. Airborne Early Warning and Control Planes, or AEW&C, are among the most underrated and underappreciated of all military aircraft. Their primary purpose, no matter who operates them or what plane we're talking about, is twofold. First, they are the planes that will detect aircraft, ships, vehicles, missiles, and other potential threats across a beyond visual range that extends way beyond the capabilities of any other plane in an air fleet. We're not talking about a radius here of dozens of kilometers, we're talking in the multiple hundreds, all within this aircraft's keen awareness. Second, they're designed to perform command and control in an air engagement, directing fighters, bombers, attack aircraft, reconnaissance planes, and any other craft that will join it in an air battle. In some ways, having a good AW&C plane confers the opposite advantages as having a stealth fighter. With a stealth fighter, the enemy can't stop you if they see you. With an AW&C plane, the enemy can't stop you because you see them before they see you. These days, there are a few AEW&C planes that make up most of the world's combined fleet.
Have you ever found yourself staring into an empty fridge and thinking, oh, what am I going to eat tonight? There's nothing in here. Well, say goodbye to that problem because I have the perfect solution for you, and that is CookUnity. CookUnity is not just another meal delivery service. It is a culinary experience brought to your doorstep. Imagine having award-winning chefs like incredible chef Chris Rattal creating mouth-watering dishes for you every week. That is CookUnity. Now let's talk about the feature that makes CookUnity stand out. First of all, the chefs. These are not just any chefs. They're culinary maestros from top restaurants across the US. Chris Rattal's got the grilled chipotle lime barbecue chicken with corn, black bean, and tomato salad. It is a flavor explosion. You will love it. And the best part, the meals arrive fresh, not frozen, in eco-friendly packaging with easy-to-follow heating instructions. CookUnity offers an ever-changing menu with over 50 chefs creating dishes to suit every palate. From bibimbap to bolognese, they've got it all. Enjoy restaurant-quality meals for a fraction of the price. Subscriptions start as low as $11 a meal. Personally, I love the flexibility because with CookUnity, you can customize your meal plan, pause when needed, and choose from a range of dietary preferences. You can choose from 4 to 16 meals a week. So here's the deal. Go to cookunity.com/mega50 or click the link in the description below and use my code MEGA50 to get 50% off your first order. It's incredible. Get ready for a culinary journey with Cook Unity. Your taste buds will thank you. Big shout out to them for sponsoring. And now back to today's video.
The Russians use the Beriev A50. The Chinese use the KJ-2000. Sweden, Brazil, Mexico, and Pakistan use the S.i.R. India uses the Netra, and the US Navy, Israel, Japan, France, and Taiwan use the E2 Hawkeye. But for several decades straight, the global leader in AEW&C has been the Boeing E3 Sentry. Now, we've already actually done a video all about the E3, so do check that out if you're interested, but suffice it to say that it's done very well in the arsenals of the US, the UK, France, and the combined forces of NATO. Equipped with a rotating radar dome grafted onto the body of a Boeing 707, the world's air fleet of 68 E3s have performed very well over time. The only problem is, they're really bloody old. First introduced into service all the way back in 1977, that's nearly 50 years ago. And while that sort of advanced age is fine for some aircraft, the B-52 Stratofortress, for example, which can bomb America's modern enemies today roughly as competently as it bombed their grandparents, an AEW&C plane is the sort of thing that you're going to want to update every once in a while. Fail to do so for long enough, and you'll start to look as if you're bringing a bit of a sword to a gunfight. And that's a problem that the United States was actually rather hesitant to solve, even despite the E3 making up most of its AEW&C capabilities through the 2020s. After all, not even America's defense budget is limitless, and it's a lot easier to get US Congress to fund an almost invisible jet that blows things up than to buy a new version of what looks to the uneducated eye like a commercial airliner wearing a top hat. But that didn't mean that Boeing was going to say no to a chance to build a next-generation AEW&C plane, and this time they were going to get the lucrative defense contracts to do it without going through the US government. In this case, it was Australia who decided to sign on the dotted line, finally making good on an initiative to pick up a plane of this type. They'd nursed their dream since the mid-1980s and finally decided to pull the trigger in 1996 when the Australian Department of Defence decided to initiate Project Wedgetail. That name, by the way, doesn't refer to the somewhat wedge-shaped radar that eventually ended up on top of the new plane, but to the wedge-tailed eagle, Australia's largest bird of prey. Makes the name a bit more badass, if we're honest. The contract for the new plane went to Boeing. Probably not a surprising development when we consider that Boeing was really the only Western air manufacturer at the time that was equipped to make an all-new AEW&C aircraft. Australia asked for 4 of the things with the potential to order up to 7, and Boeing decided to team up with 2 other major defense contractors, BAE Systems and Northrop Grumman. Together, the whole gang cobbled together the new Wedgetail plane, which took its first flight in 2004. Now, unfortunately, there were some bumps and bruises during the production process, which saw the plane's delivery delayed from 2006 to late 2009. And during these early years, Boeing missed out on other possible orders from Italy and the United Arab Emirates, which they might otherwise have gotten if production had moved on a little bit better. But eventually, the Wedgetail was completed, and on the 29th of November 2009, the first pair of Wedgetails were delivered to the Royal Australian Air Force. So by now, we understand how the Wedgetail came to be, and what role, in a general sense, it's meant to fulfill. What actually is it? On perhaps the most basic level, it's a modified Boeing 737 Next Generation, a twin-engine, narrow-bodied airliner that Boeing launched in 1993 as the 3rd generation of its 737 program. The 737 itself is a highly competent airliner, with nearly 12,000 copies built around the world, of which the Next Generation line is by far the most common. But the plane was going to require some special bells and whistles if it was going to enter military service, and Boeing was happy to oblige. The Wedgetail flies at a cruising speed of 853 kilometers per hour, 530 miles per hour, and with a range of 6,500 kilometers or 4,000 miles, it's able to linger above a battlefield for the full duration of most combat missions. It's also capable of accepting refuelings via aerial boom, which in turn enables it to hang out in the sky for as long as it takes for a pair of CFM turbofan engines to crap out. However long that is, by the way, it appears to be a longer duration of time than a Wedgetail has ever been asked to operate for in one go. Its external dimensions are those typical of a 737-700, 33.6 meters or 110 feet long, 12.5 meters or 41 feet tall, and a wingspan just touch wider at 35.8 meters rather than 32.3 on the commercial version. As for why there's that little bit of extra wing, that's to compensate for a little bit of extra weight. And, well, why the extra weight? Well, that would be its Northrop Grumman-made multi-role electronically scanned array. This array, better known as MESA, is the central element of the Wedgetail, and it features some serious capabilities. A long, slender radar mounted atop the airplane rather than the round top hat featured on most aircraft of this type, the Mesa is a gigantic radar, and it's capable of performing tasks that make it tremendously useful as a force multiplier in combat. The radar is able to track targets both in the air and at sea, as well as performing command and control operations over friendly fighter aircraft and scanning a provided area, all simultaneously and all with a range of 600 kilometers. The radar is capable of tracking up to 180 targets at once, while coordinating intercepts on up to 24 of them with 360-degree coverage. And not only that, but the array is more than capable of collecting signals intelligence and intercepting transmissions as well, with a functional maximum range of over 850 kilometers when it's at altitude. These features, taken together, enable the aircraft to completely observe and control a battlefield without ever getting within range of enemy weapon systems. It's far better at tracking objects in real time than previous aircraft. It's got a highly effective friend or foe identification system at long range, and is able to adapt and counteract when faced with electronic attacks and enemy jamming. All told, this Mesa system affords the Wedgetail complete awareness of a battle space, updating constantly and receiving and sending information via securely encrypted transmissions with friendly assets. It's highly mobile, more than able to work with US warplanes present and future, and it's built with 21st century warfare in mind, greatly increasing its operator's ability to respond to difficult conditions in combat and be a conduit between ground, air, and naval operations all across the world. Powering that operation, the plane's interior can feature anywhere from 6 to 12 operators based on current layouts, all working at terminals to attempt to process the incredible amount of information that this aircraft can take in. The rest of the aircraft is fitted with fins, counterweights, and a range of other features designed to offset the weight of the Mesa, and it comes equipped with additional space and seating to carry mission commanders and other decision makers who may use the aircraft to coordinate operations across a battle space or between multiple battles at once. When the Wedgetail first entered active service, it did so in the arsenals of 3 global militaries. Australia, where the plane reached operating capability in November 2012, South Korea, where it began carrying out missions in 2013 under the name S.i.R, and Turkey, where it was formally accepted in February of 2014 under the moniker Peace Eagle. With 6 planes to Australia, 4 to South Korea, and 4 to Turkey, the total fleet of 12 Wedgetails got to work. The Wedgetail's first operations in Australia came during the search for Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. And on this mission, the Wedgetail obviously didn't serve a combat role, but it was instrumental in coordinating search efforts between ships and aircraft on the open sea. The Wedgetail was first on the scene when Australia began taking part in the coalition air war against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, given the catchy name of Operation Okra within Australia, and during the first months of the air war, it carried out over 100 sorties and logged well over 1,000 hours of combat flight time. During those missions, a Wedgetail performed a 17-hour operational mission in November 2015, setting a new Australian record for operational duration for a single aircraft and accepting multiple refuelings in the process. Wedgetails would routinely perform sorties of 13 hours or more in Australian service, and during a rotation for one Wedgetail crew in 2016, that crew achieved 100% mission success over 36 missions, each of which took a minimum of 12 hours. Australian Wedgetails flew over Iraq and Syria through 2019, performing their missions with high competence and retaining all airframes. One Australian Wedgetail is deployed internationally as we speak. It's flying above and around Ukraine in a 6-month effort to ensure the safe transfer of supplies to Ukrainian forces. Turkish Wedgetails, or as we should say, Peace Eagles, have done similar work before and after the Australian deployment. And speaking of the Turkish version of the Wedgetail, the Peace Eagle has flown its own missions in support of Turkey's military efforts, although the nature of these operations is significantly more difficult to pinpoint. More likely than not, the Peace Eagle would have fulfilled at least some role during Turkey's operations against Kurdish forces, although since those Kurdish opposition groups don't have aircraft at their disposal, it's more likely that the Peace Eagle would have coordinated attack operations among Turkey's own warplanes while watching for surface-to-air missiles and other projectiles. In South Korea, the Peace-I, as it's called there, has taken part in joint military training exercises and presumably has taken part in the country's active air defense as it maintains a constant standby to deal with potential aggression from North Korea. For several years after the Wedgetail entered service, it seemed as if this might be the extent of its deployment. A few planes each, handed out to 3 nations in the Eastern Hemisphere that needed to coordinate air operations, but weren't about to be projecting power around the globe anytime soon. That all changed in late 2018, when the British government revealed that it too was thinking of purchasing the Wedgetail based on how well it had served the Royal Australian Air Force. So confident were the British in the Wedgetail that they didn't even hold a competition before awarding a deal, something that royally pissed off Sweden's S.i.R company, but appeared to make the Ministry of Defence very happy. The UK expects to be able to operate the first of its 3 Wedgetails sometime this year and might end up with 5 by the time all's said and done. And where the United Kingdom went, the United States followed, dealing with the realization that the Sentry, which for so long had not been ideal but had at least been acceptable, was going to be badly in need of a replacement before too long, and the US had nothing in the works. The US Air Force's announcement that it would acquire a fleet of Wedgetails spelled out that urgency, saying that the plane, to be designated the E-7 in the United States, quote, is the only platform capable of meeting the requirements for the Department of Defense's tactical battle management, command and control, and moving target identification capabilities within the timeframe needed. Put more directly, the US had dragged its feet on replacing the Sentry for a little bit too long, and now they very badly needed an alternative faster than it would take to produce a new alternative from scratch. In fact, so eager is the United States to get the E-3 out of service that even today it intends to retire half the E-3 fleet before any single replacement plane arrives. Luckily for the United States, Boeing had been continually updating the Wedgetail anyhow, and now with their deep and rather intimate relationship with the Department of Defense, it would be no trouble to whip up a new Wedgetail fleet with all the extra additions that the US could think to ask for. The US was already confident in the Wedgetail's abilities based on the ability of several of its allies to vouch for the plane, and crews were able to train on Australian versions of the craft well in advance of the Air Force even finalizing its order. In 2023, Boeing was awarded over $1 billion to develop not one, but 2 variants of the aircraft that were meant exclusively to serve the United States. At present, the US expects to submit a production order for a total of 26 aircraft when it signs the paperwork in 2025, with the first American E-7 entering service 2 years later. That's enough E-7s to phase out the entire E-3 fleet and add an extra 5 planes for posterity's sake. Whether it'll still be called the Wedgetail, we don't know, but for our money, it's a pretty cool name. And almost exactly 2 decades after the Wedgetail first flew, it continues to proliferate around the world to a growing list of prospective customers. NATO has announced that it intends to acquire 6 Wedgetails, beating out competing offers from Northrop Grumman and Saab. Whether those 6 will be the only 6 NATO acquires is yet unclear, but given that NATO originally stated it wanted 14 new AEW&C aircraft, that contract might get some follow-on additions pretty sharply. And Saudi Arabia has been in talks with the US Air Force to pick up some Wedgetails as well, even as it attempts to update its existing E-3 fleet of 6 aircraft. With more and more nations trying to get their hands on the Wedgetail, it's worth at least giving a little bit of thought to what the future for this highly esteemed plane is going to look like. The world is not a quiet place by any means, and even as we speak, the nations who have or would like to acquire a Wedgetail are conducting operations in the Red Sea, watching battlegrounds in Israel and Ukraine, waging war in Yemen, engaging in a decades-long staring contest with North Korea, hammering Kurdish forces in the Middle East, and looking to counterbalance China's growing expansion of its power in East Asia. And while we certainly don't predict that World War III is going to break out anytime soon, it's worth noting that it'll be the Wedgetail flying command and control missions in the major conflicts of the decades to come. If ever the time comes for a truly global confrontation, like the ones widely believed to be brewing between the US with its East Asian allies and China, between Israel and the broader Arab world, and between Russia and NATO, then it will be the Wedgetail that will make incredibly important tactical decisions in real time. It's no exaggeration to say that the command and control operations that take place on the Wedgetail might one day decide the course of history. And if that reality does come to pass, then those involved in the conflict who've got a Wedgetail at their disposal, we're pretty thankful that they did.
Have you ever doubted something and you're like, yeah, I hear people talking about that, but then you experience it and you're like, okay, I'm a believer. I'm in. I'm all in on this. That's where I'm at with total solar eclipses. Back in 2017, I met a guy here locally. His name is Dr. Gordon Telepin. He's a surgeon, and he just told me, he's like, dude, you're gonna fall in love with eclipses. And I was like, maybe, I don't know. I've heard they're cool. And then I just went all in. I was like, okay, I trust this guy. What's the worst that can happen? I look like an idiot on the internet to millions of people. So I did it. I went out to Wyoming in 2017. I saw a total solar eclipse for the first time, and it melted my brain. I did not understand what I was seeing. In fact, all the stuff I had prepared to do, I just forgot how to do it. It was amazing.
That is crazy.
Take your glasses off.
That is bizarre. Stars. Oh wait, it's overhead sunset.
And I want you to experience that as well. I was at a gathering the other night with a bunch of friends, and someone walks up to me and they're like, hey, Destin, this eclipse thing, right? Do I really need to do this? And my answer is yes, you must. Because once you see it...
It was one of the most amazing and emotional experiences I've ever had, other than seeing my own children being born. I still talk about it to this day, well, like I am now. Just, it changed my whole perception. It made me really want to see more of things like that. And the fact that it happens on the Earth for free, and you can just go see it, it's amazing.
As soon as it started getting darker, you could hear the insects changing. So there were all these cicadas that were calling, and then as the eclipse started happening, the cicada sound faded out and the cricket sound faded in, and then it went in the reverse. And that blew my mind. I wasn't expecting that.
I've only seen a total solar eclipse once in my life, and it was awesome in the literal meaning of the term, awe. Awful, like scary, like terrifying. Because of the immensities of the astronomical bodies involved, I felt so tiny. And that morning when I woke up knowing that it was going to happen in just a matter of hours, I became very scared. I don't know exactly why, but I think it had something to do with knowing that it was such a big event involving such big things that were so vital to our lives, and also that I could not stop it. It was inevitable. It was going to happen. I could not push a pause button and make it wait for when I was ready. I loved it.
2024, this is your biggest opportunity if you live in the United States or in northern parts of Mexico to see a total solar eclipse, and I don't want you to miss it because I love you and I want you to love eclipses. That's where I'm at. The actual moment is called totality. That's when the disk of the moon obscures or occludes the disk of the sun, and all kinds of things happen right then in that moment, and it's the only time you can see it. Like, you can see the mountains of the moon along the perimeter of the sun because you can see the jagged edges. That's called Bailey's beads. You can see what's called a diamond ring, the ejecta around the sun. You can see the corona. It's awesome. And you can only see it if you are right there in the path of totality. You have to physically be on this strip of land that goes all the way across the country. If you're 5 miles outside of that land, it doesn't work. The math doesn't work out so that you can see the total solar eclipse.
We were just outside the path of totality, and I set up cameras all over the farm to see how my animals would react to the solar eclipse. And they stood there. It got dark, it got cold, it got light, it got warm again, and they just kept eating. What a letdown.
So if it's at all possible, financially or with work, if you can make this trip with someone you love, go to the path of totality and see this total solar eclipse, because it's amazing. There's like tens of millions of people that are going to watch this event. So there's articles all over the internet about, oh, the animals are going to do weird things, or the weather might do this. I'm going to take some time, and we're going to slowly walk through, and I'm going to ask all the dumb questions of Dr. Telepin, who literally wrote a book about this moment, by the way. He spent his spare time in between the last eclipse and this one, writing this book specifically for this moment. So we're going to learn about everything called the partial phase phenomena. Now that's the time leading up to the eclipse and immediately after eclipse. There's really neat science stuff that happens when you're out there looking at the eclipse and just basking in the glory of the moment. You're going to know all the other stuff to look for as well, and you're going to have the cheat code. You're going to enjoy it on a different level. So let's do this. Let's go get smarter every day and check out all these neat phenomena with Dr. Gordon Telepin, and let's learn about the partial phase phenomena for the total solar eclipse. Do you ever think to yourself, maybe this is a little too much?
I do.
Hey, what is your answer to that?
I still do it. As long as my wife will tolerate it, I do it.
Gordon, you have created a series of, what would you call these, stations?
Yeah, they're science stations about teaching the science of the partial phase phenomena. Because an eclipse is way more interesting than just totality. Of course, totality is fascinating, it's beautiful. But there's a lot of stuff you can appreciate and enjoy about the science of what's happening with the moon blocking the sun physically during that hour and a half time between C1 and C2, first contact and second contact.
Okay, so to be clear, Gordon loves eclipses so much that you invested a lot of your own money to create this. It's an app called Solar Eclipse Timer. I get nothing for telling you this. My friend Gordon made this, and I've used it at every eclipse I've watched. It's awesome. Basically, you go to a location, you pull out your phone, you hit your GPS location, and it does all the math for you. And your voice, it's actually your voice, which is endearing, your voice will tell me how to watch the eclipse. It'll say,
it'll count down to the contact times for the photographers.
What's a contact time?
So when the moon first takes that first bite out of the sun, that's first contact.
C1.
C1. Totality starts when the moon obscures the sun completely, that's second contact, C2. When the moon moves off on the other side and the photosphere reappears, that's C3, third contact. And when the moon moves completely off, that's the end of the eclipse, that's fourth contact.
Okay, so to be clear, these science stations that we're talking about, the totality is just between C2 and C3, but all this stuff happens during the partial phase phenomenon between C1 and C2 and between C3 and C4.
So the first station is temperature monitoring. I've monitored and data logged temperature at all my eclipses, but this time, because I can bring a lot of equipment and drive it to Texas, I wanted to do more. So I have a 4-station temperature data logging tower here.
Okay.
What we're trying to do here is document a mini inversion layer.
So these are temperature loggers?
Those are temperature loggers.
And you have 3 on the pole?
And 1 on the ground covered by some soil.
Okay.
And that is being heated by the sun right now. And these others have free air circulation around them, so they're monitoring the air temperature. The ground sensor will decrease in temperature during the partial phases before the 20-foot sensor decreases.
So basically, people that are at the event, they'll start feeling the temperature change.
That's right.
But just know it's not happening the same all the way up.
That's exactly right.
All right, let's go to the second station here, Gordon.
So the second station is the concept of pinhole projection of the crescents. So when you hold up something and it's a dot, that the light from the sun goes through those dots, but it crosses. So light from the top of the sun crosses through the hole and it goes to the bottom, and light from the bottom crosses through the hole and goes to the top, and right to left crosses. So right now, we're only seeing round circles because the sun
You made one for me.
I did. Smarter every day. So we're seeing round circles, but during the partial phases, these will turn into crescents.
Now we're seeing round circles right now because we're not in a total solar eclipse right now, or even a
we're
partial.
not in the partial phases. So these will turn to crescents during the partial phases. And the interesting thing is, before totality, the little banana crescent will be one direction, and after totality, it'll flip. Get some paper and punch holes in it, do your name or do the date, whatever you want to do. Bring a colander to the eclipse.
Yeah.
Kitchen utensils are great.
Can you pull it away from the thing more, the further away?
Well, the more you pull it away, you see it gets out of focus. And a little bit of that has to do with the thickness of what you're using. That's why it's good to use thin paper.
Or like a cheese grater.
Or a cheese grater, so a cheese grater will do it.
So on eclipse day, people should pack the colander.
Exactly. So the other thing for pinhole projection is to make a pinhole projection shoebox.
Oh, it's actually a pinhole.
It's a pinhole in tinfoil and a little viewing box in the back and a white card on the bottom. So when you get it lined up, the little crescent phase will be projected in the back of the box, and it's a safe way to watch the partial phases because it can't hurt your eyes.
What about glasses? Do people need to wear glasses?
So everybody has to go to the eclipse with certified solar eclipse glasses. Start to order them now because they're going to get harder to find. And you wear these during all the partial phases. and then you take them off during totality. It's the only time it's safe to take your glasses off.
I've heard of people using like
ISO
welding glasses and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on that?
So welding glasses are not certified because they don't block the right amount of infrared and ultraviolet light. So these are certified to block the right amount for viewing. It's got to be ISO 12312-2.
So make sure that everybody with you has the correct glasses. You want to be safe. Don't look directly at the partial phase eclipse. That could actually injure you, but you can take the glasses off during totality.
You have to take them off during totality, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
sounds good. What's our next station here?
So this is sharp and fuzzy shadows. If you take something that's 90 degrees apart like this, when you rotate this during the eclipse, the one that gets sharp is going to be in line with the crescent. The one that is staying perpendicular to the crescent, behaving like an extended source of light, that's going to be fuzzy. Let's say this is the sharp edge. That's going to be the sharp edge. That's going to be fuzzy, and that's going to be fuzzy, and this will be sharp. All the parallel sides will be sharp, and all the parallel sides will be fuzzy.
So if I'm watching the eclipse on eclipse day, when people say, my shadows look weird, that's what's happening.
That's what's happening. They may not know it, but now they'll know it.
What do you have over here?
So we're going to monitor the wind at this eclipse. You know, you'll see a lot of articles on the internet before the eclipse that says the weather changed during the eclipse. Well, there are a lot of thermodynamic effects during the eclipse, but it doesn't really change the weather. But there is a very hard partial phase phenomena to witness, and that's an eclipse breeze. The theory behind it is...
An eclipse breeze?
An eclipse breeze.
Okay.
If you have calm conditions at your observing site, and there are some mountains or hills in the distance, but relatively close, and they are in the direction of umbra approach, the ground there will cool before your ground at your observing site, just like we did at the temperature tower. And that cool air in those valleys will coalesce, roll down the valleys, and you'll feel it as a cool breeze coming from the direction of umbra approach.
As the cooler air is more dense, it's going to roll downhill.
That's right.
And that's what you're going to try to capture here?
That's right. So our observing site has a nice flat area, and it also has some hills to the east and the south. And so I'm going to have this pointing. This is a data logger. We'll have it pointing to those hills, and we'll see if we have calm conditions, if we can pick up a subtle eclipse breeze. Remember, it's subtle.
Yeah.
So this is a station that talks about the creation and dissipation of convective clouds. And they're created by the ground being warmed by the sun and creating moisture that rises as eddies. And these red arrows represent warm, moist eddies rising. And when that moisture hits the boundary layer, it condenses and it makes those fluffy clouds. But they are reliant on that continued energy of the sun and the continued supply of moisture. So the eclipse is going to shut off that energy and shut off that moisture, and those little fluffy convective clouds can actually dissipate before totality. Within 10 or 15 minutes before totality, there'll be these white puffy clouds in the sky, and they'll start to go away.
Wow, but not all clouds will go away, to be clear. So don't,
Right.
Disclaimer, if you're at a place with clouds, like big clouds on eclipse day, get in your car, go down the path one way or the other to try to get away from the clouds,
Big, thick, gray rain clouds are not reliant on this kind of energy. They're more of a weather front type clouds, and they won't have time to dissipate because of the decrease in the thermals.
I don't know what to say about this other than this is definitely the cutest station here. What is... What is this? Come on over and show me.
So this is to teach people about the animal behavior. We're adults, and we're humans, and we have brains, and we know an eclipse is happening, and we're watching it. We're in this field watching it because we know all about it. The animals don't know about it. They just think it's getting dark. So they think nighttime is coming, so they start their nighttime behaviors. It's fascinating. This is a graph of the lux going down. And again, we won't even notice that anything's changing till about within 10 minutes or 8 minutes of totality. But the animals will sense it a little bit earlier.
Really?
So if you're in any natural environment at all, the first thing you'll hear is crickets. Crickets go crazy during the eclipse. Like this place, if this was in the path of totality, it would be wild. It would just be wild. About 10 or 15 minutes before totality, the crickets will start. The second thing that people are not aware of, and that's why I have the bird here, if you see a group of birds in the 15 minutes before totality flying like they look like they're going somewhere, that's probably not random. That's a behavior. They're going to their nighttime resting spot, so be aware of that. Bees use the sun to navigate. That's how they get to their flowers, that's how they get back to their hive. People put video cameras up at the hives, and before totality, the hives got very active because the bees were trying to get back to the hive before it got dark.
Really?
And they found that bees that couldn't make it back, if they were in some field and couldn't get back to the hive, they would land and they would wait for the sun to come back before they went to the hive or went to their flowers. So bees are really sensitive to these light changes and they change their behavior. So if you're a beekeeper and you have bees and you're in the path of totality, put a video camera up at your hives and you'll be able to document that. Or if you're in a place with a flowery bush that the bees love and they're buzzing around it, put a video camera on the flowery bush. It'll be really busy during the partial phases, and when totality gets closer, the activity will go down.
Really?
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What about this chicken?
It's my chicken animal behavior video. I had a farmer in Nashville monitor their chicken coop for me. I mailed them a camera and a tripod. It's amazing to see what chickens did before and after totality.
We're gonna watch Gordon's chicken video, okay? I like it. What else we have here?
So this station is about the Purkinje effect.
Okay, this one's complicated, so I'm gonna leave the long description over on the second channel video, but basically this is what happens. You have rods and cones in your eyes, and the cones are light sensitive to colors, and the rods are more monochromatic. So basically what happens is as the eclipse comes closer, the color sensitivity of your eyes changes, and you start to see colors different. The bright colors look muddy, and it just makes it feel really weird. Go check out the second channel if you want the whole description. But Gordon did something really funny so that you could remember to wear bright color shirts and stuff on eclipse day so that you can sense these changes in your eyes.
I need to do something.
Okay.
You know, this is way over the top.
Okay.
But I'm gonna do it.
Okay.
I made up Purkinje effect shirts.
Okay, great. All right, and it actually says Purkinje effect smarter every day.
So
okay,
put
great.
that on.
This is my smarter every day Purkinje effect shirt. How long have you been planning this?
About a month.
Okay. Are you gonna wear this on eclipse day?
Absolutely.
All right, this is what I was so excited about in 2017. Shadow bands.
Yeah.
Yeah, or as I call them, shadow snakes. You don't like that name, do you?
I like it. I like
You like the name shadow snakes?
I do. I like it because that's how I described them when I saw them in 2002, because they look like rows of snakes that were wavy but in lines, millions of snakes in lines. And what it has to do is that little slit of light is making little rectangles on the ground, but they're in the direction of the slit, so they're always in rows, and the way the atmosphere is going to perturb them will make what their behavior is going to be. So they could be shifting from left to right, they could look like they're leapfrogging like snakes, they could be very stagnant if the atmosphere where that light is coming through does not have a lot of motion.
This sounds crazy. I know this sounds crazy. It's not crazy. I saw it in 2017. If you're watching the eclipse, hopefully they have your solar eclipse app.
Right, and I'll remind them to look for shadow bands at 90 seconds, 60 seconds, and 30 seconds before C2. Because the thing is, you're so excited about the partial phases and totality coming, and the crowd's going crazy, there's this huge buzz. You have to be forced to look down at the ground.
And so you just look, like if you're looking here, you look for shadow bands like here.
That's right.
Okay.
So put a white sheet in front of your group or white boards.
Wow, and it looked like, I don't know the directions, but it looked like low contrast shadows.
Right.
And it looks kind of like boiling water, but it's in rows.
It's in rows.
It's really strange. It's hard for cameras to pick it up.
Yep.
Because of the dynamic range of the camera sensor. But just look at the ground, and you said afterwards it's better, right? Like
afterwards it's better because before C2 they kind of fade in as the lighting is going down and your dark adaptation is getting better. But after C3, you're dark adapted and the sun comes back as a very fine slit instantly, and that's perfect to make shadow bands. My app will remind you to look for shadow bands again after C3 because they can be more dramatic after C3.
This video is not sponsored. This video is supported. And when I asked the supporter, what would you like the call to action to be at the end of the video, they said something very interesting. They said, ask people to be thoughtful about the video they watch after this one, because what you put in your mind is important. That's amazing. Let me tell you about these folks. So this is an organization called the Independent Media Initiative. It is a new thing. If you think about it, if you're a YouTube creator, you have an incentive to make sensational content. Like if I can get a bazillion views on a video, then I can get more people watching it and the numbers go up and I can get more sponsorship. That means more money. Therefore, there's market pressure to make sensational content. That is not good for society. By the way, I really like this cypress swamp. It's really cool. I came out here because it's quiet. I put a little portrait at the end of this boardwalk. We're gonna walk there and I'm gonna show you something. So the Independent Media Initiative is trying something new. They're partnering with foundations to get nonprofit money into the IMI, and then they're going to try to select creators that are authentic, genuine, making educational, artistic content, and they're going to try to create another second path to promote those creators. Like when I was a kid, there was this program that I used to watch that made me think about feelings, it made me think about all kinds of stuff. In fact, sometimes I would get to go on a field trip to like a manufacturing place, like a factory or something. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It was awesome, and I loved it. I want to be remembered as somebody that makes stuff kind of like Mr. Rogers made me feel, like that kind of stuff. And that's what IMI is going for, the Independent Media Initiative. So again, I asked them, what is the call to action of this video? And they said, simply to remind viewers to be thoughtful about the next video you select to watch after this one. That's it. If you don't know where to start, they've got a selection of creators on their website. You can go check those out. That's a good place to start. But anyway, that's it. I'm grateful to IMI for the Fusion Award. I'm grateful for their support of Smarter Every Day, and I'm grateful for what they're trying to do for the future of intelligent, respectful content on the internet. Thank you very much. Any last minute advice? They have to get into the totality band. Where should they go?
So I'd watch the weather a few days before the eclipse and plan to try to drive to a bubble of high pressure.
Okay. So have multiple options and make your decision.
Be mobile.
I get nothing out of talking about Gordon's app. It's legitimately good. Basically, wherever you are located on eclipse day, you hit a button, it'll get your GPS position.
And then it'll just talk them to the eclipse. Just have them turn their phone on and listen to the announcements.
If you had to pick one or two things, what would you recommend?
Pinhole projection.
Yeah.
Make up a card with your name on it. Pinhole project your name, and sharp and fuzzy shadows.
And the crickets are just going to happen.
Let nature do its work.
These days, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that America's greatest export is actually its culture. In fact, it's a strange phenomenon of this modern age. Just how much knowledge we Brits have about our Yankee counterparts over across the pond. A flow of knowledge that really, for the most part, only goes one way. Take politics, for example. You'll often hear Brits sharing an opinion on Donald Trump, but you'd be hard put to find an American that knows very much about the British Prime Minister, let alone their politics. The reason for this disconnect is, in a word, Hollywood. In a few more words, it's down to America's ability to make entertainment profitable. In a great many more words, you would say that there are a plethora of factors that have caused this. For starters, the reason that California became the hub of American film was not due to a surplus of talent or excellent shooting locations, but rather because California was the furthest you could get from New York, which made it difficult for New York-based Edison Motion Pictures Company to prove that the burgeoning studios were using their cameras and film, thereby avoiding payment of the huge royalty fees that came along with the use of said cameras and film. This money that would have otherwise bankrupted the studios was then spent on improving the quality of the film productions so that they very quickly became better than any other studios in the world. That created demand for American media, which, well, then exponentially grew their profits. It's also no coincidence that a nation defined by its military budget also sets the standard for technological innovation. Tie into that equation a cultural proclivity of grandiose projects, and you've got a perfect storm for a sort of engineering-based YouTube channel. And what could be more grandiose a project than putting the faces of some of your most fundamental leaders on the side of a huge granite mountain? We don't exactly know a whole lot about why or how it was built. I mean, we can understand the thinking behind it, but also, why build it in South Dakota of all places? If I were to try and think of one thing that would make sense to an American, but 0 sense to a British person, it would be carving the faces of some of our leaders into a mountain. We can't be certain, but we're pretty sure the artist selected for prime ministerial portraits wasn't selected for their painting ability, just the person who could paint the fastest, so they didn't have to stand there too long. Anyway, we're getting off track. Let's talk about Mount Rushmore. It's why you're here. So, before we talk about how the faces got there, we should first cover how the mountain itself got there. Very simple, the Earth put it there, and the stuff that happened after that is where it really gets interesting. The first known inhabitants of the area were the Lakota tribe, hence the name of the state, Dakota. The Lakota tribe as an entity is known through legend to have had their beginnings on the shores of Lake Superior, though their language is said to have predated them and is thought to be from a tribe that lived on the shores of the southern Mississippi River. It's important to qualify the difference here, as the language was spoken by a few other tribes that lived in that part of America. For their part, the Lakota were mostly a hunter-gatherer society who supplemented what they could hunt with crops of corn that they grew. After feuding with another tribe in the area, they were pushed out of the Great Plains in the mid to late 17th century, the Great Plains being the Dakota region of the United States. It's around this time that the first known people began living on and around Mount Rushmore, though it is likely there were others that just weren't documented. The name Mount Rushmore is also fairly contemporary. At the time, it was known by a few names. To the Dakota people, those were the Six Grandfathers and Cougar Mountain. But to early American settlers, the mountain was called Sugarloaf Mountain, Slaughterhouse Mountain, and the Keystone Cliffs. Speaking of colonialism, the first Europeans to arrive in the area that is now South Dakota were a couple of French explorers who promptly claimed that land in the name of France in 1743. Understandably, the natives didn't appreciate this kind of claim when they kind of already lived there. The battles that were fought between the indigenous people and the colonial powers, and then later the American government, well, that's a topic for a whole other video. As it pertains to today's video, though, an agreement was signed in 1868 called the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which brokered a peace between the United States and the Lakota, as well as several other tribes. This agreement created an area of land that would be the absolute property of those tribes, encompassing the areas of what is now South Dakota, Wyoming, and Nebraska. The agreement also stipulated that white settlers would be restricted from entering the area and would be prosecuted if caught. This would be, in essence, a separate state from the United States that was ruled by the tribes and their laws. This meant that breaking the agreement was against the law, and there was absolutely no way the government was going to ignore its own signed treaty. I mean, that would definitely never happen. I mean, even if they found loads of gold. Right? I would like to avoid the mistake that others have made when retelling this event. It's not as though the US government had a state-owned gold mining company that just rolled in and took everything. And despite our jokes here, they simply couldn't just tear up the treaty. However, what they could do was use the very loose language of the treaty to allow for some wiggle room for their responsibilities, such as the policing of the border, because it was their job from preventing any outsiders from entering the land. In fairness, they did do this, but considering the size and technological capacity of the US Army, even in those days, they did a less than stellar job, even before the discovery of gold. It's also not as though the government weren't looking for a reason to evict the indigenous tribes, considering how they sent 2 separate expeditions to verify the presence of gold, which very quickly became national news, and what was at first a trickle of intruders became a deluge of miners and prospectors. When first discovered, a conglomerate of mining companies offered to purchase the land and the mineral rights, an offer that was promptly refused, with the added unanimous response that nothing short of annihilation would remove them from their ancestral lands. Then there was the government's paltry offer of $25,000 for all of the lands, which comes out very roughly to about $665,000 today, which, even before you consider the cultural value of that land, is, well, an insultingly low offer. Every offer the tribes received was refused, insisting that no amount of money would be sufficient for their land. Once the diplomatic method had failed, the tribes began hunting any mining groups that crossed onto their land, which in turn opened the door to the US military rolling in once again and forcibly evicting the tribes, for good this time. In all of the land that was taken, there was also a small ridge that at that time was known as the Six Grandfathers. The land was almost exclusively the property of the local tribes up until the time it was annexed by the United States, and, well, once those floodgates were opened, prospectors from across the United States moved all over the land, thoroughly mapping it and prospecting it for gold as they went. A wealthy investor by the name of Charles E. Rushmore began visiting the area regularly to hunt and prospect. As innocuous as most of the other marble ridges in that part of the world, it was a long time after the annexation of the Great Sioux Reservation that this ridge was renamed after that investor. In 1930, it was officially recognized by the United States Board of Geographic Names as Mount Rushmore. With most peaks getting a name as well, this one stood out in several ways. First was that the mountain had a southward face that gave it near constant sunlight during the day. This was especially true in the summer months. Second was that the land around it was contrived in such a way that it was highly visible from nearly every angle, which made it a landmark that could easily be spotted from a long distance. Of course, this was back when landmark literally meant marks on the land that people could use to navigate themselves. Outside of that, however, it was a corner of the world that remained all but forgotten. As the decades slipped by and the US went from a burgeoning state embroiled in civil wars and land disputes, the mountain remained as unchanged as ever. It simply watched as the US became an international manufacturing powerhouse and began developing its own personality as the protector of freedom, as it became the center of revolutions of every kind, be it technical, financial, industrial, and, of course, cultural. While everything and more changed all around it, the mountain continued, unchanged, uninterested by all that was going on around it. It was, in fact, these changes that would rather take an interest in the mountain. By the time the 1920s came around, America was keen to make an expression of its position. In 1923, historian Jonah Robinson, who was the head of the South Dakota Historical Board, conceived of an idea to make a grand memorial to the individuals that had helped shape the modern United States, pitching it as a means of increasing tourism in the area. To him, this memorial would be for the individuals that stood out for their impact upon the history of the United States. It would be a representation of the grand strides that the nation had made to bring it where it was today. And the Granite Mountains of the Black Hills would be the perfect place to do it. Robinson was able to convince the sculptor Gutzon Borglum to take a trip to the Black Hills and look at his chosen location. At first, this was going to be a location made up of granite pillars called the Needles. However, after visiting, Borglum concluded that the needles were too thin and unstable to be capable of taking any kind of heavy construction. As Borglum was transported around the Black Hills, he saw a mountain with a south-oriented face and a topography that suited being viewed from nearly 180 degrees. This was, of course, Mount Rushmore. He brought the idea back to Robinson, who was initially resistant, but after visiting, he agreed that it would be
the perfect location. With this, Robinson and Borglum began pitching the idea to various investors. Robinson brought it to the state senator, who in turn brought it to Congress. In the meantime, Borglum began to find private investors among his rich friends, which begged the question, who are they going to put on the mountain? To us today, when we hear of Mount Rushmore, we instinctively think of those four faces: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. But they were not the originally planned subjects. Being a historian, Robinson knew of the history of that land, and he knew the history of the nation better than any politician. When he said he wanted to make a memorial of the individuals that had shaped the modern United States, he didn't mean presidents. Originally, he planned for a far more inclusive proposition, a monument to those who had shaped the nation physically as much as they had culturally. His initial proposition was for the monument to be people like Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, Buffalo Bill Cody, and leaders of the Lakota tribe like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse. However, the powers that be, namely Borglum and Congress, felt the monument would have a broader appeal if it focused on presidents rather than explorers and tribal leaders. It was decided that the likeness of the aforementioned presidents would make a suitably grand installation. At some point during the process, Borglum became infatuated with the idea of this great monument. Perhaps he saw that it was indeed going to become one of the most recognizable monuments in the world, but what's more likely is he would come to see it as his magnum opus and a means of carving his name into the history books. Very soon, his vision began to eclipse that of Robinson's, and more than that, he began to eclipse Robinson himself. It was Borglum's idea to change the subjects of the monument, and in fairness, without this, it's uncertain as to whether the project would have been able to get past the funding phase. For his part, he was able to play on the patriotism of private investors, and also pitching a monument to politicians is a lot easier to do when said monument is of politicians. Indeed, Calvin Coolidge was rather pleased with the idea of having a monument that depicted 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. Coolidge, of course, was a Republican. To hear Borglum put it, the selected presidents represented key facets that led to the modern United States: Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln, representing the nation's birth, growth, preservation, and development respectively, which clearly went down well because the total funding that would go into the project was around $1 million, which equates to around $20 million today. Though half of this would come from private investment and generally only came in dribs and drabs through the process, Borglum wanted to get started as soon as possible. So once there was enough funding to pay for the start of construction and all the planning permission had been acquired, construction went ahead. Before any kind of chisel could be put to rock, the pen had to be put to paper, and Borglum was absolutely going to be the one to do it, so perhaps it would be a good idea to examine the bombastic personality and aspirations of Gutzon Borglum. In doing so, we could start to get a pretty good explanation as to the bizarre nature of the project itself. Borglum was a highly accomplished sculptor with Danish lineage. He had worked on several other large art projects in his time, but Rushmore was by far his largest and greatest. Though he was originally reluctant to come on board, he became infatuated with the idea of designing this monument. What we see today is truly only the surface. For one thing, the enormous faces on the mountain were meant to be enormous heads with torsos attached. You can even see the shape of George Washington's lapels and ties. Due to budget and funding issues, however, that was ultimately not to be. But we're going to find out a bit more about that later. For now, let's just talk about Borglum's vision. In Borglum's mind, as we mentioned, this was going to be his magnum opus, the work with which history would remember his name. His vision was less a monument and more a museum carved into a mountain with a president-shaped billboard on the outside. Within the mountain was going to be what Borglum called the Hall of Records, which would be dedicated to the ways that America had impacted the world. There would be areas dedicated to other great Americans, and another part that would showcase some of America's most precious public documents, namely the Declaration of Independence. Then there would be sections explaining the purpose of the monument and relating the process of creation, and if there was perhaps a corner in the Hall of Records dedicated to little old Borglum himself, well, that would just be a bit of a bonus, wouldn't it? On the outside, there would be a complex around the mountain, though it's unclear as to what the purpose of this complex would be outside of housing tourists. Borglum also envisioned an 800-step staircase carved from marble that took tourists from the designer's studio into a Hall of Records. But as you've probably already surmised, these theme park-esque features of the monument don't exist because they were never built. But au contraire, they do indeed exist. As anyone who has visited the monument can likely tell you, there is a chamber within the mountain, but we'll get to that part in a moment.
As you might expect, the removal of a face-shaped amount of rock from the side of a mountain is no mean feat. Times that by 4. And once the designing process was complete, all that was left to do was build this thing. In the space of only a few months, this hard-to-access backwater became a bustling thoroughfare of artisans, miners, and mountain climbers. In the discussions surrounding the project, the vast majority were at least in agreement that the addition of the two most famous presidents of the United States was a foregone conclusion, with this being Washington and Lincoln. Borglum states that the choice for Thomas Jefferson was for his work in nearly doubling the size of the US during his time with the Louisiana Purchase, and Teddy Roosevelt was added in for his work establishing the US National Park Service. The designs, as previously mentioned, called for the presidential figures to be depicted from head to waist. The monument that exists today is 60 foot or 18 meters high from crown to chin. However, if built as originally designed, these colossal figures would theoretically have been 240 feet or 73 meters in height. This was, of course, wildly ambitious, but Borglum and everyone else for that matter must have been feeling pretty ambitious because the first design was approved. And so it was that on the 4th of October 1927, only 4 years after Robinson initially pitched the idea, construction began. Over the course of the project, a total of 300 workers took part in its construction. The area very quickly became a busy work site. First to go up was a staircase that would allow workers to get to the top of the mountain. Then, after a while, a cable car system was built to facilitate the moving of heavy machinery to the peak. Once this was made, a hydraulic pulley system was set up on the peak that would allow the workers to lower themselves onto the mountain face. As previously discussed, this kind of project had never been attempted before by anyone, so there was a lot of technology that had to be either invented or adapted to suit their needs. First was the rigging, which had to make sure the workers were secure while working on the mountain. To solve this, Borglum and his team adapted a type of harness called a bosun seat, which was originally designed for the Navy so as to allow access to a ship's rigging. Then there was the small matter of how you operate heavy machinery on the side of a mountain without falling off. I don't know if you've ever used a jackhammer, but I wouldn't advise doing it dangling several hundred feet off the ground. Then there was the use of pneumatic drills, which, as you can probably already tell, requires a pneumatic compressor, and it's not particularly easy to mount a pneumatic compressor on the side of a mountain. So they had to bring in some of the most powerful pneumatic compressors in the world and then place them at the base of the cliff. The added distance required the extra power. However, in the early stages of the construction, or rather destruction, these drills were secondary to the true star of the show, dynamite. And a lot of it. The work started with George Washington. First, they set about removing the largest parts of the rock face, forming it into the overall shape of a face. They did this mostly by using dynamite. They would drill holes into the rock face, place the dynamite, and then detonate it. This, of course, would have been a fairly skilled job, knowing how the rock would react, how much dynamite to use, and where, as you might imagine, people would be rather upset if George's nose was a little bit off-center. From the very first day, though, there was a real sense of pride in what these workmen were doing. As you can imagine, to be involved in this project would have been a big honor. Borglum was ambitious, but even more than that, he was inspiring. He knew how to motivate, and he focused on the patriotic grandeur of the project to motivate his workers, and he did his best to get the best out of them. Of course, this charisma was somewhat tempered by his bullying demeanor the rest of the time. Overall, though, the work was taken on with a gusto that allowed work to progress quickly. Until it didn't. Remember Borglum's so-called rich friends? Well, they were more of his non-existent rich friends, or rather they existed, but they weren't his friends. They were just some regular old run-of-the-mill rich private investors. So when work started in October of 1927, it was on a cumulative $10,000 that Borglum had gathered from these private investors, which lasted a grand total of 1.5 months before they ran out of money and everyone on the site just packed up and went home. Then in June of 1929, a full year and a half later, Congress finally came through on the funding, committing a full $500,000 to the scheme. The financial history buffs among you will have already heard some alarm bells ringing at that date. The Great Depression would kick off only 2 months later, that August. And as it turned out, huge government-funded vanity projects aren't a good look when millions of people are all of a sudden standing in line for the soup kitchen. However, in a rather fortuitous turn of events, the funding for the project would be approved just before the extent of the crash was known, and Congress agreed to honor the agreement. From there, the funding ran out about a year and a half later, and Borglum was back to going around propositioning investors. Meanwhile, George Washington's face was looking pretty good. However, what was less good was the area allocated Thomas Jefferson's face. It wasn't good, as in that area the rock was too unstable, so Thomas Jefferson, who was originally intended to be built to the right of George Washington, his right, our left, ended up getting moved to the left of George Washington, his left, our right, which suited old George just fine, I'm sure.
As the monument began to take shape and the years began to move onwards, sporadic funding caused a stopping and starting of the flow of work. In spite of this, it wasn't long after the moving of Thomas Jefferson's face that we begin to see the sculptors moving in. Their job was to take the general shape of the rock and turn it into faces. In essence, they were to add the fine detail that made them look human, and they were to do it on a scale many hundreds of times larger than anything they'd ever worked on before. This was positive in some ways because they could swap their chisel for jackhammers and the aforementioned pneumatic drills, but it was negative in others in that they had to do work in some pretty appalling conditions. There were quite a few ill health effects suffered by the workers, though they weren't experienced on site. These ill effects were suffered in later life for the most part, the most prominent condition being silicosis, which comes about as a result of breathing in granite dust. It will not cause immediate issues, but over time it will result in pulmonary fibrosis. Masks were provided for the teams of artisans, but the heat from the wall being in near constant sunlight made it nearly impossible for them to breathe with the masks on, so many just took them off. Their method of working was to drill small holes in the rock face at equal distances apart at a depth that they wished to remove, which would weaken the rock. Once this was done, they used jackhammers to break off the chunks of weakened rock, leaving the general features of the face behind, although I imagine they looked like they had pretty bad acne. Once an area had been cleared, other artisans would then go in with finer tools to complete the fine detailing of the faces. George Washington's was the first to be completed in 1934, a whole 7 years after construction had started. It was revealed on Independence Day by allowing a huge American flag that was covering the effigy to fall to the ground, because America will always be America, we guess. After that, it was a matter of just ticking off the presidents one by one. The next to be completed was Thomas Jefferson in 1936, Abraham Lincoln in 1937, and finally Teddy Roosevelt on the 2nd of July 1939, and construction for the Visitors Center had already begun by the time they were working on Lincoln. As I said, Borglum was nothing if not ambitious. These ceremonies revealing the completion of the faces were merely a means of garnering interest from investors. He was still dead set on the grand proposition that was the Hall of Records. However, by the time the 40s rolled around, government funding had well and truly dried up. This was in part due to the fact that Borglum's plans had been shifting from day one. There was originally meant to be an 80 by 100 foot commemoration of the Louisiana Purchase, where Lincoln is, and plans for the presidents to be constructed from head to torso were still in full swing. By the time Roosevelt was completed, the work had already begun on Washington's jacket. As for Hall of Records itself, well, I was on its way. Emphasis on the word was, though. For one thing, by 1941, the funding from the government was entirely gone, with any spare funds now going towards the war effort, that being the assistance of the UK and the production of the Liberty ships. Then there was the small matter of Borglum dying unexpectedly that same year, which, as the sole fundraiser for the project, kind of halted it in its tracks. They had carved 70 feet into the mountain for the Hall of Records, they had started on the torso of George Washington, and the Visitor Center still needed a few final touches to be considered complete. However, as nobody was going to be giving any more money, and as it had already been decided that all tourism to the site would be free, there was literally no reason for anyone to go to work. So they didn't. Today, you'll see the rubble at the foot of the mountain from the work being done. At the time, there wasn't even the funds to get that cleared away. The work just stopped and never started again. However, in spite of the fact that a project such as this had never been attempted before, and the fact that many of the construction practices were being made up on the fly, the project never had a worker fatality, and only 2 accidents occurred over the entire project. After the death of Borglum and the beginning of the Second World War, the recently finished monument garnered some attention from the public, receiving an attendance of 390,000 visitors in the first year. In the war years, especially between 43 and 45, the numbers took a dip, but after that, they mostly rose from then on until today, with a few dips in times of financial turmoil. The recent attendance record was set in 2010 with 2.3 million attendees in 1 year. Culturally, it's come to represent 20th century America, and as we've discussed, that was a very different place than modern America and the modern world for that matter. In recent years, it has been suggested that there should be various different additions to the mountain face. These have ranged from tribal leaders like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse to politicians like Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama. These have been mostly rejected due to the vast majority of the stable rock being taken up by the original inhabitants of the mountain. There is also the issue of funding and the uproar that would come from changing an American monument. However, that is not to say that changes have not been made to the mountain in the years after Borglum's death. For many decades after he died, his family were trying to complete the design that he had originally established many decades ago. Most of this was to no avail. However, in 1998, funding from the National Park Service and the Borglum family was enough to put the finishing touches on the 70-foot passage that was supposed to be the entrance to the Hall of Records. At the end of the passage, the floor was dug out and a titanium vault was placed within it. Within the vault was a teakwood box that contained 16 enamel panels. Inscribed upon these panels was a variety of important American texts, including the Constitution and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, as well as a recounting of the life stories of the 4 presidents and also one architect. Can you guess who it was? On the outside, the Park Service paid for a revamp of the visitor center, modernizing the area and adding various different structures. The Lincoln Borglum Museum and the Presidential Trail were both added, as well as the infrastructure around the site being entirely modernized. As the decades have worn on, the monument has appeared in countless pop culture references, the most notable of which was the chase scene across the heads in the 1956 classic North by Northwest. Various people have also become synonymous with the structure, such as the fifth face of Mount Rushmore, aka Benjamin Black Elk, a descendant of the medicine man Black Elk. He has also earned the title of the most photographed person in the world, posing for literally thousands of photos every day for nearly 20 years during the 1950s and 60s, doing all of this dressed in his traditional native attire. In more modern times, the mountain was dragged into controversy. Remember that agreement signed by the Lakota chiefs way back in 1851? Well, for all intents and purposes, that land was still theirs. They had a document signed by the US government giving them sole ownership of that land. They never broke any of the terms, never accepted any offers to sell the land, and ambiguous though the language was, it was inarguable that the land did legally belong to them. In 2007, they brought this grievance up with the United Nations and the US courts, going so far as to establish a new country known as the Republic of Lakota, right there in the United States. This nation would take up an area of roughly 200,000 square kilometers and would contain parts of Nebraska, Wyoming, North Dakota, and of course South Dakota. Unfortunately, in order to be considered a nation, you need to have other nations' agreement that you are indeed a nation. And if your nation removes a big chunk of another nation, and if that nation just so happens to be the most powerful nation in the world, well, you're going to struggle to get other nations to side with you. That's because the United States doesn't take kindly to other nations taking their lands. It's ironic, we know. And if the US doesn't like you, that almost certainly removes any possibility of other nations liking you, because people don't like disagreeing with the United States. It generally ends badly for them, which is a really long way of saying that the United Nations refused their request for nationhood. Of course, this conflict has been embroiled in court battles for many years. The US still has no legal right to flip the Union, still if that to take land, including the Constitution and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, as well as a recounting of the life stories of the 4 presidents and also one architect. Can you guess who it was? On the outside, the Park Service paid for a revamp of the visitor center, modernizing the area and adding various different structures. The Lincoln Borglum Museum and the Presidential Trail were both added, as well as the infrastructure around the site being entirely modernized. As the decades have worn on, the monument has appeared in countless pop culture references, the most notable of which was the chase scene across the heads in the 1956 classic North by Northwest. Various people have also become synonymous with the structure, such as the fifth face of Mount Rushmore, aka Benjamin Black Elk, a descendant of the medicine man Black Elk. He has also earned the title of the most photographed person in the world, posing for literally thousands of photos every day for nearly 20 years during the 1950s and 60s, doing all of this dressed in his traditional native attire. In more modern times, the mountain was dragged into controversy. Remember that agreement signed by the Lakota chiefs way back in 1851? Well, for all intents and purposes, that land was still theirs. They had a document signed by the US government giving them sole ownership of that land. They never broke any of the terms, never accepted any offers to sell the land, and ambiguous though the language was, it was inarguable as the infrastructure around the site being entirely modernized. As the decades have worn on, the monument has appeared in countless pop culture references, the most notable of which was the chase scene across the heads in the 1956 classic North by Northwest. Various people have also become synonymous with the structure, such as the fifth face of Mount Rushmore, aka Benjamin Black Elk, a descendant of the medicine man Black Elk. He has also earned the title of the most photographed person in the world, posing for literally thousands of photos every day for nearly 20 years during the 1950s and 60s, doing all of this dressed in its traditional native attire. In more modern times, the mountain was dragged into controversy. Remember that agreement signed by the Lakota chiefs way back in 1851? Well, for all intents and purposes, that land was still theirs. They had a document signed by the US government giving them sole ownership of that land. They never broke any of the terms, never accepted any offers to sell the land, and ambiguous though the language was, it was inarguable that the land did legally belong to them. In 2007, they brought this grievance up with the United Nations and the US courts, going so far as to establish a new country known as the Republic of Lakota, right there in the United States. This nation would take up an area of roughly 200,000 square kilometers and would contain parts of Nebraska, Wyoming, North Dakota, and of course South Dakota. Unfortunately, in order to be considered a nation, you need to have other nations' agreement that you are indeed a nation. And if your nation removes a big chunk of another nation, and if that nation just so happens to be the most powerful nation in the world, well, you're going to struggle to get other nations to side with you. That's because the United States doesn't take kindly to other nations taking their lands. It's ironic, we know. And if the US doesn't like you, that almost certainly removes any possibility of other nations liking you, because people don't like disagreeing with the United States. It generally ends badly for them, which is a really long way of saying that the United Nations refused their request for nationhood. Of course, this conflict has been embroiled in court battles for many years. The US still has no legal right to that land, and yet they own it, so the US justice system has done its utmost in the intervening years to claim it back. This has taken the form of multiple court battles that all go the same way: the US government versus the Dakota and other tribes. The tribes will invariably win the court case, the US government will offer a settlement that gets larger and larger every time this goes to court, and every time the tribal leaders refuse the money. In 1980, they were offered $105 million for the land, made up of a land valuation of $17.1 million, as well as 5% interest that had been accumulated from when the land was first valued in 1887 and 1980. The offer still exists, and as of 2011 has a compound interest value of over $1 billion, which the Lakota tribe are still refusing, insisting they only want the return of their ancestral lands. And that's where we stand today with the story of Mount Rushmore. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do hit like, don't forget to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
It feels like a scene from a climate change dystopia. A world in which 80% of all land has been rendered uninhabitable by human greed. Once lush forests replaced by a toxic desert. A world in which the groundwater is poisoned and all of humanity is forced to survive on a narrow, survivable strip of land between desert and ocean, even as the waves rise ever higher. No, this isn't the synopsis for some new Netflix satire, a much more depressing companion piece to 2021's Don't Look Up. The place that I just described, it really exists. A real-life island state that today stands as a stark warning to the rest of the world. And that island's name is Nauru, and it was ground zero for an environmental apocalypse. It wasn't meant to be this way. In the early 1980s, Nauru was, per capita, one of the richest nations on Earth. Its government oversaw a sovereign wealth fund sufficient to keep its entire population in luxury for centuries to come. Yet these days, the nation stands as a broke, near uninhabitable wasteland, a place of poverty and of desperation. It is the story of this